I still haven't figured out how to make her be quiet. First thing we'll do is take a quick look at the syllabus. Now I know Brother Roger and Ms. Roslyn online are auditing the class. I assume, Mr. Paul, that you are too. Auditing rather than taking the class for credit.
Yeah.
Okay.
You just said, yeah.
So I'll go over the syllabus just from the standpoint of here's what we're going to cover and the order we're going to cover it in. But auditing the class, the assignments are yours to take or leave as you please. So that's, if you want to do the tests and the quizzes and research paper, that's up to you. If you're going to do that, you might as well get credit for it, but that's up to you. There are some topics on page 3 in the syllabus for that research paper if you want to do that. Just things that I think you might find very interesting to study. Now, the overview of the class, really tonight and next week, we're really not going to get into the text a whole lot, because I want to spend tonight kind of going back a little bit, tying this together with 2nd Chronicles and 2nd Kings and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. And then next week, we'll talk more about the social and political and the environmental circumstances of Judah in captivity and coming out of captivity and going back to the land of promise, and how things had changed over 3 generations for them. Because the Judah that came out of captivity was not even remotely the Judah that went into captivity. The nation had changed dramatically over that span of 70 years, really about 3 generations time, and it continued to change even after Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah led captives or returnees, exiles, back to Jerusalem and Judea. Judaism would never be the same after captivity. So you have a schedule of what we'll cover in the syllabus here on pages 3, 4, and 5, and 6 and 7. It's all laid out, kind of just break it down. We'll take the books in order they appear in the scriptures, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. For what it's worth, in the Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah were traditionally considered one book. They were not separated into 2 separate books. Esther, on the other hand, stands alone. All the rest of this in the syllabus is just kind of boilerplate about the way the school grades and things like that. But as we look at the background of all of this, these pages out of the way, where we're coming from in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther is right off the end of 2nd Chronicles. 2nd Chronicles ends with Judah going into captivity. Now, what happens between 586 and 536? Now, that's only 50 years, 70 years of captivity. How do you get 70 years out of 50? Well, that's, you go back to when captivity actually began, when Nebuchadnezzar first enters the picture. That's not 586, that's 606 BC. And about 3 years earlier, roughly speaking, Nebuchadnezzar, who had been basically a general in the Assyrian army, his ancestors and antecedents had been subservient to the Assyrians. Well, the Babylonians rise up and hollow out the Assyrian Empire from the inside. They take out the Assyrian rulership and become the Babylonian Empire. Mentioned last time around, last semester, from a historical point of view, from a political, worldly point of view, there's no reason that the Babylonians should have been able to do that. They were a province of the Assyrians. They were a vassal kingdom. From an economic, military, political, cultural standpoint, their sudden dominance doesn't make any sense at all. How long does the Babylonian Empire actually last? less than 100 years. And then the Medo-Persians, who are subservient to the Babylonians, form a coalition between the two of them, and they overthrow the Babylonians overnight in the book of Daniel. Well, there is an explanation for Babylon's prominence. Babylon appears like a shooting star across the historical sky and then burns out. Why? Serves God's purpose. The difference between the Assyrians and the Babylonians, in a nutshell, is this. When the Assyrians conquered and assimilated a people, like they did with the northern kingdom, the 10 northern tribes, they would relocate them. They would try to forcibly convert them to whatever religion, from whatever religion they were, to Assyrian gods and deities. And they would try to relocate somebody else into the territory that they had vacated. We see that. Isaiah talks about that with the Assyrians taking the northern kingdom out of the way. They tried to replace the culture and the religion and the thinking and the identity of the people that they conquered. Now, the Babylonians do that to some degree. The difference on a practical level between the Babylonians and the Assyrians is that the Babylonians don't try to forcibly convert the people that they conquer. They're perfectly willing to let them go on worshiping their gods for the most part. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's business with the big tower and all the sacred music, that's kind of an aberration for him. By and large, they are pretty willing to let people alone religiously, as long as you knuckle under, pay your taxes, do what you're told. Also, when they transported people out of an area like the Jews, they didn't automatically transport somebody else into the territory. Now, if somebody else moved in, that was their doing. And that's kind of what happens with the territory of Judea. There's not a concerted effort to replace them. So 70 years later, the Jews are allowed to begin returning home. They don't return to a completely empty land, but they also don't return to a situation like Israel would have found had they tried to return to their territory, where somebody else entirely had been settled there and taken over. It's not like when the Israelites came out of Egypt and supplanted all of the Canaanites. The Jews basically get to go back to a more or less empty territory that had been their territory. They don't try to obliterate, the Babylonians don't try to obliterate all vestiges of Jewish identity. Now, we look at Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the three friends. They're carried away into captivity in 606, the first of three deportations. They're nobles, they're children of high-ranking officials. And what does Nebuchadnezzar do with them?
Make them higher.
Puts them straight into training, basically sends them to college in the Babylonian school system to become Babylonian civil servants. And part of that, appoints a portion of the king's food and so on and so forth. Part of that is calculated to try to get them to identify as Babylonians, not as Jews, to get them to be primarily loyal to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire and so forth. And what we see with Daniel and his companions is that they are the best civil servants Nebuchadnezzar could want, as long as he lets them be faithful to God. The only time they ever really get into trouble is when their faith comes into conflict with something that the king wants. And in those cases, God vindicates them. And what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He backs off. So, in captivity, you have a nation of people who historically have been very almost xenophobic, very, very isolated in some respect. Now, Solomon sent his ships and his sailors pretty much all over the known world. Solomon made his fortune trading. You could arguably make the case Solomon was, in some respects, was an arms merchant, selling horses and chariots and so forth. But Solomon's interactions with the larger world and his government's interactions with the larger world were not typical of most of the Jewish people. From the time that Abraham entered the promised land to the days that Joshua led Israel's greatest generation to conquer the promised land 430 years later. From that time until the days of Jeremiah and Daniel and Ezekiel, Judah was really a pretty isolated nation. The Jews pretty much kept to themselves, except when they were at war with somebody or when they tried to adopt the idolatry and the customs of their neighbors, and it got them in trouble with God, which is, of course, why they go into captivity in the first place. So, Judah going into exile is one people. 3 generations later, Judah coming out of exile is a whole different people, because they've had 3 generations of exposure to people, to religions, to governments, to ideas that had been completely foreign to them up to this point. Now, another point to consider: how many Jews went into captivity from 606 to 597 to 586? 3 deportations. They took the children of the nobles basically in 606. 9 years later, they come back and they take what amounts to the middle class and the tradesman class. And then in 586, with Zedekiah on the throne, it's just like, we're going to take everybody that's worth anything at all. And those folks have a very different experience than the previous deportations. How many Jews went into captivity over 20 odd years? We don't have a firm count anywhere in the scriptures, but a reasonable estimate would be well over 1 million, possibly several million over the 20-year period. How many end up coming back in the days of Cyrus? Less than 100,000. In fact, probably less than 60,000. The number that we get in Nehemiah is right at 50,000. And that includes servants and so forth. So you go from potentially several million, certainly hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million, 70 years before, 50 years before, down to roughly 50,000, 60,000, 50 years later. What happened to all the other Jews?
A lot of them decided they wanted to stay in Babylon because they were
Exactly.
well off.
Exactly. They stayed where they were, except that by that time, they weren't all with Ezekiel down by the river Kibar in Babylon. By that time, they've begun to be scattered throughout the Babylonian Empire. How many provinces were there in the Babylonian Empire? You've got 127 provinces that stretches basically from the western border of India, more or less, all the way over to modern day Turkey, all through the Middle East, up into the southern parts of Eastern Europe, Armenia, places like that, possibly down almost as far as Egypt. So you've got a huge territory, and you've got Jews that have begun to spread out and move all over that. Now, if they're captives, how does that work?
But Jeremiah told them, you're going to be allowed to be there, just stay there and prosper.
Exactly. Jeremiah said, pray for the welfare of the place where they settle you,
Yeah.
the city where you are. The thing about it was that the nobles' children, like Daniel and his companions, they weren't restricted to Babylon. They traveled back and forth between Babylon and Shushan and other places, different provinces and so forth. They're in the Babylonian foreign service, basically, in the Babylonian bureaucracy. So they go wherever they're sent. Beyond that, now you bring in the next group, which is some of the largest number of people in the days of Ezekiel. Ezekiel doesn't go into captivity in 606. He goes into captivity in 597, along with a big number of the priests and the elders and what we would consider the middle class of the nation, the working people, the tradespeople, and folks that were useful to the Babylonians. They're not marched away in chains. They're deported lock, stock, and barrel. Bring your tools, bring your family, bring all your stuff. You're going to need it where you're going. And when they get to Babylon, what's the basic restriction that they have? You can't go home. You can worship your God. You can buy a house. You can buy a farm, plant a vineyard. We expect you to do that. We expect you to contribute to the economy of the nation. How does it turn out for them? Ezekiel spends chapters 1 through 24 of the first half of his writing arguing with the elders who were deported, arguing with the leadership that were deported to Babylon, who all they can focus on, we want to go home, we want to go home, we want to go home. And what is he telling them? You've got it better here than back there. God put you here for a reason. In the last deportation, 586, Jeremiah watches this up close and personal. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's honest to goodness mad because Zedekiah has fooled around, played around, tried to play both ends against the middle and so forth. And the people that are there in Jerusalem, in Judea, they're not the skilled tradespeople for the most part. They're not the high-ranking nobles. They're the lower classes. They're the priests and the Levites who are not dedicated or faithful for the most part. They're the advisors to the king who are saying what they think he wants to hear, not what he needs to hear. And that's how Zedekiah winds up being run by his nobles, and they end up resisting instead of surrendering when Nebuchadnezzar comes calling. What is Jeremiah's advice all along? When Nebuchadnezzar comes, lay down your arms, open up the gates, and surrender. And they call him a traitor for advising that. That's God's instruction. And instead they fight so determinedly that when the Babylonians come in, they just obliterate the city. Those Jews are marched away in chains, sold as captives, as slaves in the markets in Babylon. Now, interesting thought, who bought them? Certainly some of the Babylonians.
Yeah.
So far as we know, there was nothing to prevent their own people who were already there from purchasing them as well. And there is no reason that some of them would not have. Now, these people going into captivity have spent generations 10 generations at least, thinking of themselves as God's elite. In that era leading up to captivity, they've developed an attitude about themselves that we see carry over into the New Testament in the days of Jesus. That they're the only, in their minds, they're the only people that God cares anything about. It's ironic that the Pharisees try to argue with Jesus, we're Abraham's seed, we've never been in captivity to any man, when their whole Pharisee party is an outgrowth of captivity in Babylon. Their whole identity as a group of Jews within the nation comes from that event in Babylon. So in exile, you have one nation that goes in very, very isolated, very xenophobic. We don't want anything to do with anybody outside, except when we do, with idolatry and so forth. The people that come out are very different. Now that leads to another aspect of this, and we'll start to see this in Nehemiah. And we'll see the contrast to it somewhat in small ways in Esther. Captivity is a defining event for Judaism from that point forward. One of the things that it defines is a division in Judaism. Because those who return under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah are forced to make some hard choices, some hard decisions, to do some hard things. You look at the end of Nehemiah, the foreign wives and children and so forth, the language of Ashdod and all this. They had to make some hard choices to be faithful to God, to define themselves as Jews, not just as the neighbors. Jews who did not return didn't always have to make those choices. And what you see develop out of this period is what you see in Acts chapter 6, where you got the church, which is made up of Jewish people converted to Christ at that point, converted back in Acts chapter 2. What arises in Acts chapter 6 in the first 7 verses or so?
Hellenistic widows were
You
ignored.
Yeah, the
Exactly.
Grecian.
There you go. You've got a division within the church. All these people are all Jews before they were Christians, but the division breaks down not along the lines of anything that has anything to do with their Christianity. The division breaks down along the lines of, are you a Judea Jew or are you a Jew from somewhere else? And that's emblematic of the massive divide that existed after captivity in Judaism. And so the Judaism that comes out of captivity in many, many ways is altogether different than the Judaism that went into captivity. So, why did they go into captivity in the first place?
Idolatry.
Idolatry. In a word, idolatry, unfaithfulness. God said, I'm God, I'm the only God, worship me. And what did they do? Worshipped everything in addition to God.
Wanted to worship God, and
It was, there you go. It was always God and, not God or. They always wanted to hedge their bets. What's Ezekiel's contention with the elders in captivity during that period leading up to from 597 to 586, before the temple is destroyed and Jerusalem is obliterated. The elders argue constantly with Ezekiel. Oh, no, 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 you can't possibly be right. God wouldn't be so mean. The temple is still standing. The temple, the temple, the temple. That's God's proof of who we are. That's his presence among us. And what's the message? If that's what it takes to persuade you, I'll take your temple away. And that's what he did. Well, then, and we'll get to this a little bit more next week, the second half of Ezekiel's writing and his work with those people in captivity is they're saying, well, the temple's gone. Maybe we just imagined God. Maybe he's not even real. And Ezekiel's telling, no, of course he's really did exactly what I told you he was going to do. Now do what I'm telling you and he'll restore you to your land. And it took 2 more generations to get that into their heads. It took 2 more generations for them to repent. Did they ever fully repent of their idolatry?
No.
It was a lot better, but they didn't fully.
They never again brought in a foreign idol. But what they developed with the best of intentions was a system that turned the law of Moses into their idol for all practical purposes. Instead of worshiping the God that it glorified, they worshiped the law itself and their interpretations of it. They almost took God out of the picture in some respects. So the cause of captivity was their idolatry. The purpose of captivity was what?
Their idolatry.
That's what took them there. What was captivity meant to do?
Straighten them out.
Let them repent.
There you go. Burn it out of them, basically. Get them to recognize God's in charge. Now, the whole time that they're about to see this terrible destruction and suffering in 586, what are Ezekiel and Jeremiah in particular telling the people?
Stay, he's okay.
Yeah,
He's okay. Yeah.
God's going to take care of you. God's going to restore you. You brought this on yourself. You're going to suffer. And when you repent, when you straighten out, God will bring you home. 70 years corresponding to the years of Sabbath years that they had neglected, the years of Jubilee years that they'd not kept, and so forth. 70 years of punishment. 70 years for the land to be free of their faithlessness until they had paid for all of those years that they'd neglected God. The purpose of captivity was to bring them back to him. Now you think about this. Somebody tells you you're going to jail for 70 years. That's effectively what God did. Put them in jail, and from our perspective, we'd say, well, he didn't even go visit them. He did. He sent them Ezekiel and Daniel. Daniel served through the whole time. He must have been an old man by the time the Medo-Persians come along. But all this time, what are they doing if they're paying attention? They're counting. God told them 70 years. Once they figure out, oh, that started with Daniel and his bunch. Think about the people that come in 586 and 585 as they arrive. They've got 50 years ahead of them, and they're slaves, unlike their kinfolks over here that are prosperous. Now, they can be bought out of slavery, and their circumstances will improve. No doubt many, if not most of them, were. But in 586, what's their prospect? 50 years of slavery. In 546, how are they looking at it now? 10 years to go. 9, 8. Now, maybe they don't have an exact date. They can't exactly circle a date on the calendar. But in that third generation, they know if God's going to keep his promise, we must be getting close.
Daniel seemed to think that he had a pretty good date because
Yes, Daniel had a good date. And we'll talk more about Daniel and his 70 weeks as we go along, because that bears on some of this as we go along. But as they go through their captivity, as God continues to take care of them, they begin to recognize time is passing. If God is going to keep his promise to restore us, time's getting closer. So, the purpose of captivity, idolatry caused it. Submission to God, repentance, was its purpose. God promises restoration. He doesn't take away, and there's a good lesson, you can preach this. He doesn't take away their punishment. They serve the whole 70 years. The consequences of their sin are not ameliorated at all. But when it's done, it's done. And so his promise, the prophecies, come to pass. Let's talk about apologetics, evidences, for just a minute. What's the strongest evidence that you can offer somebody to prove that the Bible is exactly what it claims to be?
fulfillment of prophecy.
Exactly. John said about Jesus in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, about the miracles and the signs and the wonders that Jesus did. These and many other signs Jesus did that are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe, and that believing you may have life in his name. The prophecies, Old and New Testament prophecies alike, are there for the same purpose. How many times in the book of Matthew in particular does Matthew tell us about Jesus? He said this, or he did that, or this happened so that thus and so would be fulfilled. What Matthew was emphasizing to the Jewish readers was the fulfillment of prophecy. Because when you can point out that a prophet foretold this event or that individual 100 years ahead of time, or in the case of Cyrus with Isaiah chapter 44, about 300 years ahead of time, and then lo and behold, it comes to pass, and here's the person that Isaiah named doing the thing that Isaiah said he'd do. There's no way to explain that but God. Now, the skeptics try to say that two different individuals wrote Isaiah, or 3 or 5 or a whole multitude over a whole span of centuries, but there's no evidence for that. There's no good argument for that.
And when Daniel makes prophecies that don't come to pass for 400, 500,
Yeah.
600 years. Yeah.
Daniel's 70 weeks are one of the most fascinating prophecies in all the Old Testament because of what it leads to. Leads to Christ. But not only that, it's fascinating because of the understanding the people had of what he said. We look at Daniel's 70 weeks and most of Protestantism tries to figure out how to make that apply to the end of time. And Daniel wasn't talking about the end of time. He was talking about the coming of the Savior. And the Jews from his day to Jesus' day understood what he was talking about. So what are they doing in the first century? Man, they're looking for the Messiah. They've counted 490, all these years and so forth. They've added this up. They've figured this out. It's got to be getting close. And sure enough, in the fullness of time, here's Christ. Prophecy ought to be maybe the most compelling proof of the truth of the scriptures. So let's talk a little bit about Ezra rather, and Nehemiah and Esther. Had my head too much in Ezekiel the last few minutes. Ezra starts with the fulfilling of prophecy. You look at Ezra, and where does he begin? In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Whoa, wait a minute. Who is Cyrus, king of Persia? Well, just flip back a page, 2 Chronicles, and look at chapter 36. And what do we find? Cyrus, king of Persia, is the ruler who took the place of Belshazzar, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He is the one that overthrew the Babylonian Empire. Now, Darius enters into this, and there's some discussion back and forth amongst the scholars as to who is the king and who is not, and how do these two fit together. And there's some speculation that one was actually the local ruler and the other was the overall ruler. And there may be some substance to that. But Cyrus seems to be the overall king, the one in charge of everything. So in the first year, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus. Now, this word had been given 100 years before. Jeremiah spent 40 some odd years prophesying to Judah. If they go into captivity in 586, where does that put Jeremiah's beginning of his prophetic work? About 626, between 625 and 630. So 40 plus years before, in the days of King Josiah, when he was welcomed in the court, not told to go away and leave us alone.
Well, it says Jeremiah chapter 1, 7th year of Josiah.
There you go. There you go. So you've got all these years before the captivity even begins. What does Jeremiah tell them? This is going to happen. God is going to send you into Babylonian captivity. Now, at least one of their rulers had already had some experience in Babylon. That's Manasseh, 100 years before. But God let him come home from Babylon. Jeremiah says, you're going into Babylon, but God's going to bring you back. And now here comes Cyrus. Just as Isaiah had said 200 years before Jeremiah, named him by name, here comes Cyrus to make good on Jeremiah's prophecy, not to mention Isaiah's before him. But notice how I'm stuck in Ezekiel, I'm sorry. Notice how Ezra expresses this right from the get-go, that the word of the Lord might be fulfilled. Here's why he did it. It wasn't that Cyrus had any particular love for the Jewish people. In fact, historically, what Cyrus did was he released a lot of captive peoples, not just the Jews. What he said is not, okay, you Jews can go home, but his decree says anybody of Judah and the tribes of Israel, any of the northern tribes that are related to them that want to, can go. Who actually goes home? You look at the people that accompany Zerubbabel and then Ezra and then Nehemiah, and you have Jews, but who else do you have?
Anybody else that wasn't.
You have a sprinkling of Levites and of the odd Benjaminite here and there.
Yeah.
After all, where does Saul of Tarsus come into this? Now, some of his immediate ancestors apparently didn't go home because he's not from there. He's from Turkey. He's from Tarsus in Cilicia, which is south central Turkey. But you have a sprinkling of some of the other tribes, not all of them, and not many of the others. After all, where are the 10 tribes in all of this? They had been overrun by the Assyrians 140 some odd years before the Babylonians conquered Judah. They had been assimilated into the Babylonian Empire and then inherited by the Medo-Persians. And in all of this, where was their religion?
For most of them, it was not in existence.
Exactly. Their religion.
Oh, no.
No, we're good.
Okay.
Yeah. Their religion was Jeroboam's idolatry, plus whatever else they incorporated. And they brought in the idolatry of some of the others as well. But as a people, their loyalty to God was functionally non-existent when they went into captivity. And it didn't get stronger in captivity. The interesting thing about them is that all through that period leading up to captivity and even during their captivity in the Assyrian Empire, what's God doing with them? He's still sending them prophets. He's still sending them word. Come back to me and I'll bless you. So we get down here to the days of Cyrus, and Cyrus says, okay, anybody of Judah and these other tribes that are related to him that wants to go home can go. And mostly Jews, but a smattering of others take them up on it. Now, how does this work? You have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews over here in the Babylonian Empire. And you end up with between 50 and 60,000 in and around Jerusalem. What do the others do? Well, it's like we said a while ago, they've settled down. They're living prosperous lives for the most part. They've got kids and grandkids there, and grandma's buried over here, and mom and dad are going to be planted there when they die. This is home to us over here in Babylon or in the land of the Medes or the land of the Persians or in what used to be Assyria or Syria. All the places where they are, they're settled there. And not only that, what else is taking place in their identity? They're beginning to get away from their Hebrew identity. Now, the Ugaritic and languages like that of the Babylonians and the Medo-Persians are not so different from Hebrew that they couldn't communicate to each other. Arabic and Hebrew are related languages. Modern Arabic, modern Hebrew are related languages. Both sides bristle at the thought, but they are related. It's a little bit like Spanish and French and Portuguese. They all have a common basis. But when you speak this language all day, every day, and not your mother tongue, what happens to you after years and years of that?
You see a lot of Spanish doing that in this world.
Exactly.
Your children are growing up being proficient in English and less so in Spanish.
Exactly. Immigrants to this country who are native Spanish or German or French or Chinese speakers who speak that language routinely at home can't get along in those languages out in the open, so they have to learn some English to get by, don't they?
Yep.
The children go to school, they're taught in what language? English. Now, I have a cousin whose children went to school in San Antonio, and they were taught from kindergarten up in Spanish, but they were not native Spanish speakers. It was a Spanish immersion program. It was so that they'd learn Spanish as a second language. But they function in English. What happens when grandkids come along? You know, the kids, they still speak and understand Spanish at home, but when they marry and have kids, what about their kids? Well, they know a few Spanish words, abuela, abuelo, grandma and grandpa, but they're English speakers from the get-go. The same thing is happening to a lot of the Hebrew people in captivity. Part of their fundamental identity, which is their Hebrew language, is slowly eroding. Now, it's not too bad in terms of its effects during this period, because the languages that they speak, the Ugaritic and so forth, that the Babylonians and the language of the Assyrians and so forth, they're related languages. But what's going to happen another 200 years down the road?
What we see in the New Testament.
From
They spoke mainly Arabic, or
Well,
not Arabic, but
except-
Aramaic.
except that these Jews, not the folks that return to Judah,
Yeah.
but the Jews that live out in the Gentile world, in the 330s, 200 years after Cyrus, an army from the west is going to come pouring through there, conquering everything in sight, led by a flamboyant young man named Alexander. And Alexander's whole purpose was to spread Greek culture and religion and politics and philosophy and language. He was an apostle of all things Greek. You know, it's said that Alexander the Great conquered the world and then wept, for he had no more worlds to conquer. I don't know if there's any truth to that or not. He died in a drunken stupor, apparently. But Alexander conquered the world because he thought he was bringing the blessings of everything Greek to the whole backwater world. What he was actually doing was God's will in preparing the way for the Christ. So he didn't know that. These Jews, from the days of Nebuchadnezzar down to the days of Alexander, are gradually moving away from their Hebrew-based identity. Now, that's important for a number of reasons. But perhaps the most important reason is you can almost draw a straight line from Nebuchadnezzar and captivity to the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, in the late 300s down into the early 200s. Why did the Jews produce a Greek translation of the scriptures?
Because so few of them spoke Hebrew anymore.
Exactly, because so few actually spoke and understood Hebrew. And the thing about that, what that has to do with the price of tea in China, as they say, is that until after Christ, Hebrew, written Hebrew, consisted of 22 consonants. Now, if you go through your English Bible and you take out every vowel, A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y, or as I was taught, occasionally W and sometimes Y. You go through and take out every vowel and you're just left with consonants. How easy is it to read your Bible?
That's difficult.
It gets much harder, much quicker, because unless you're an English speaker, you can't tell for sure what vowel sound goes in those words. So, sorry about that. That's a text from much earlier today. So, to read ancient Hebrew, you had to be able to speak ancient Hebrew. Without vowels written down, if you didn't speak the language, you didn't know how to pronounce the words that you were seeing. Now that, on a practical level, that gets us in modern times to what's called the tetragrammaton, that 4 Hebrew letter word that we translate YHWH, or older Germans called it JHVH, Yahweh or Jehovah. That is actually the name of God in the Old Testament. How's that actually pronounced? Well, what they did was they took the vowel sounds from the word that the Jews pronounced, which is the Hebrew word for Lord, Adonai, and plugged the vowel sounds into those consonants, and you get Jehovah. But Jehovah's not a Hebrew word. It's a made-up word. And occasionally you run across somebody that gets really exercised and upset about that. And we can argue over it all we want to, but it doesn't serve any purpose. It's one of those endless questionings that Paul warned Timothy about. But these people, the Jews who did not return, are inevitably moving away in some respects from their Jewish background because of where they are. Now, the other side of that coin is the Jews that do return. Zerubbabel's, Ezra's, Nehemiah's people, the 50 or 60,000 that become the nucleus of New Judah. Well, what do we see them doing at the end of Ezra and then more so at the end of Nehemiah? They're trying to put things back the way they were. They're trying to reestablish things just like they were, not just like they were, but like they should have been before captivity. They rebuild the temple, they rebuild the walls, they reconsecrate the priesthood, they restart the morning and evening sacrifices and so forth, the reading and the teaching of the law. And they continue that. Now, when they continue that in Jerusalem, what language do they continue that in? They speak Hebrew. They're not so far removed in 536 that they've lost their Hebrew language. So you have 2 tracks of Judaism developing in this post-exile world. You've got Judaism that's very Moses and the prophets and Hebrew based, and you've got Judaism out in the world, which is huge numerically by comparison, which is still based in Moses and the prophets, but is much more familiar with and ultimately much more accommodating to the larger world. You've got a society now that is not at all isolated like their great grandparents had been. You have a society of Jews now that are very familiar with, and not just familiar, but very comfortable in some respects in the Gentile world because it's profitable for them and they live well. And something else that enters into their place in the ancient world is their cultural background. What defines every Jew's cultural background?
They wear the hat.
Well, that's a symbol of it, the yarmulke, but what defines them as Jews?
Circumcision.
Well, circumcision. But getting back even beyond that, they have something that God had given to no other people on earth at that point. A written
And the law.
law. Exactly. They didn't just have the law like the patriarchs did. They had a written law. Now, if you can't read, what good is a written law? But they had a written law. And so, unlike most people in the ancient world, the average Jewish man could read and write. And they prized education above nearly everything else because that let them draw near to God. They could read the law for themselves. Now, they didn't have copies of it just lying around. The priests had the copies of it for the most part, but they could go to, at this point, they could begin to go to a new institution in their history, a local facility where there was a copy of the law called a synagogue. There were no synagogues before captivity, as far as we know. There's no record of them. Synagogues seem to have developed in and out of captivity because what was missing during the most of the captivity period?
Annual
Worship.
Jerusalem.
There's no temple. There's no pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Judaism was always, for the most part, a home family-based religion. They didn't typically go to the temple on the Sabbath. You know, the whole nation didn't immigrate to the temple every Sabbath day for Sabbath services. They worshiped at home, Friday evening into Saturday. They made pilgrimages for the holy days and the feast days, but for the most part, their worship was home-based. Well, there's no temple, no sacrifices during this period of captivity. The priesthood has no focal point to their existence during these decades of captivity. So what do? They begin to organize themselves into groups in this community and this community and that neighborhood to study the scriptures, to keep alive their knowledge of God. And the outgrowth of that is what we call the synagogues. But even before that, because they had a written law, it was important to these people to be able to read, to understand what they read. So in the ancient world, the average Jewish man had a marketable skill that most other people in the Gentile world didn't have. He could read and write. Well, if you can read and write and most other people can't, guess what? That opens up all kinds of doors, not just for you to make a living, writing letters for other people, being somebody's secretary, keeping records, things like that, working as a government bureaucrat and so forth. But that also elevates you in society. You're not a nobody digging ditches. you're a somebody that other people need. And so the Jews tend to percolate upward in their society, even in the Gentile world. So that's a good place to take a break. That's a good place to stop and take about a 10, 12-minute break. So let's, unless you have questions or comments, let's do that, and then we'll come back and talk a little more about the background of all of this. And that's where we'll focus for the most part tonight.
All right, it's good seeing you.
Well, it's good to see you, Mr. Paul. How you been? Okay, so let's go back to sort of an overview of the book of Ezra. We talked about the background, and we're going to come back and talk more about the background of all of this next week, because that really does play into a whole lot of what we see in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther especially, actually. But talking about Ezra, like I said, this begins chapter 1, verse 1, with fulfilling the prophecy about Cyrus that Jeremiah had mentioned 100 years before, that Isaiah had mentioned 300 years before. Cyrus was named as the one who would let the Jews go back to Jerusalem and begin rebuilding the temple. And it's that King Cyrus who is mentioned in an archaeological find called the Cyrus Cylinder, which is a stone column that has a record of the things that he did. And one of the things that's mentioned is he let these nations return to their territories. And guess who's right there in the middle of them? Judah. Well, you have an archaeological confirmation of what the Bible says. Now, we tend to look at that. We're believers. We tend to look at that and say, why do we need that? Well, we don't. We believe what the book says. But we live in a world full of people who don't necessarily. But here's an archaeological find that says this actually happened. Consequently, people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens can't come along and just dismiss everything in the Bible out of hand as myth and fiction, because the Bible is talking about something that's independently documented. It's proven. Now, you look at Ezra chapter 1, verses 2, 3, and 4, and the king's own words are specific. And it's critics would say this is Ezra's priestly interpretation, and perhaps it is. But even so, it's the fulfillment of prophecy. You look at verses 2, 3, and 4, here's the proclamation. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Now, raises a question. Was Cyrus a believer in the God of the Jews? There's nothing in history that would suggest that. There's nothing here that suggests that he was a believer in the God of Israel exclusively. Notice how he says this. The English Standard says, he is the God who is in Jerusalem. Now that reflects a common belief among the Gentiles of the time, the locality of gods. Now we saw that back in Jeremiah's day, and even earlier in the days of the kings, when various kings would argue, well, their God is a God of the mountains and our God is a God of the plains, and so forth. And that this God only has influence and power in his territory. Part of that goes back to a misunderstanding of God, of the whole idea of God. Because among the Gentile nations, the gods, the idols that they worshiped, were described as being very arbitrary, very random, and you had to make offerings to them to try to get their favor. They didn't favor you necessarily, but you tried to buy them off basically with your offerings and your sacrifices. But the other side of that was, if they're God in your territory, they're kind of expected to do what you want them to do because this is your territory. The God of Israel was a conundrum to the ancient Gentiles because he didn't fall into that mold. What do the Jews tell them? Our God is God everywhere. The Babylonians moved them 1,000 miles east, basically. And they expect, okay, you've left your God behind. So sing us a song about your God, about your nation, about the lands you grew up in. And how do they respond in the Psalms? How can we sing the songs of our God in a strange land? They're buying into it a little bit too. It's as if we've left God behind. Our temple's been destroyed and so forth. Cyrus doesn't, there's nothing to indicate that Cyrus worships the God of Judah any more than he worships any other God, but he acknowledges that God. And when he says, the Lord, the God of heaven, has authorized me to do this, well, how does that play into this? Is it possible, or maybe even likely, that Daniel or some other high-ranking Jew with knowledge of the scriptures and the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah came along and showed him where Isaiah had written 300 years before he was king? This is the man who's going to do this. This is a prophecy about you, O king. That would be impressive to him, especially given that he's mentioned by name. And all the things track right down to him. Well, if he knew who I was before I knew who I was, maybe I ought to pay some attention to what he wants me to do. So, go home. But notice what else he does. He doesn't just say, you can go home. He also says to all the other Jews in exile, you support them. You underwrite their journey. You pay their way. If you're not going to go, you're not off the hook. You have a temple to underwrite. You have a temple to pay for. So pony up, gold and silver and pack animals and so forth. So we've got, oh, it must be your phone. So we've got Jews that are willing to go home, willing to go and start over from scratch. And then we've got those that are willing to, and under command, to pay their way. So Ezra's story just picks up where Chronicles leaves off. And then you get down here to chapter 2. We'll just kind of survey through these chapters quickly. Chapter 2 is a detailed listing of all the families that actually went back. These were the people of the province who came up out of the captivity of those exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried captive to Babylonia. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town. Now that's an interesting statement in its own right, because it says they returned each to his own town. That tells us something about the reason that there were so few who returned. Because when we get down to Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah, we get down to actually reestablishing the nation. How big is the nation of Judah actually going to be? it's not going to be like it was in Zedekiah's day, where he had fortified Jerusalem and a ring of fortified cities around it and pasture lands and villages and so forth. In fact, Judah, the nation of Judah, for the foreseeable future at this point, for the next 2 or 3 generations, is basically going to be the city of Jerusalem and about 10 to 15 miles around it. And so when these people each go back to their own town, well, that's just a very limited area that these people are going to. So the folks that were much farther out, they're not going back. And you think about, why would they not go back and reclaim their land? Well, the farther away from Jerusalem they are, if they're going to go back and reclaim their land, the farther away they are from what? Given that the whole land has been devastated and basically vacated, they're far away from shelter, from protection, from fortifications. When Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah go back, where do they go? They go to the site of Jerusalem. Well, what's there? Exactly, a bunch of rubble. They have to start from scratch. And what are the first 2 things they build, basically, begin building? Temple and the walls of the city. Well, what are the walls of why do the walls of the city matter?
Security.
Exactly. Because about the first thing they encounter when they get there is opposition. Especially in Nehemiah's day, when you have Sanballat and Tobiah, who are trying to undermine everything they're doing. The land, the Jews have been gone for 3 generations, mostly. There were a few left behind, and some of them fled to Egypt. But the folks that were left behind were the people who were almost literally not worth the cost of paying the freight to haul them off into Babylon to sell them for slaves. Those people were not loyal, faithful servants of God, other than Jeremiah. In fact, when they came to Jeremiah and said, shall we stay here or run away to Egypt? What was the answer that Jeremiah gave them from God? God says, stay put. And they said, oh no, our bags are already packed. Come on, we're going to Egypt. And away they went. And what did Jeremiah tell them? If you run away from God, if you run away to Egypt, you're going to die in Egypt, and it's not going to be of old age. Oh no, we're going to Egypt. Off they go. So the people that Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah and their companions encounter, if they have any common background with the Jews, they're the people who were not faithful. They're the people who were not loyal. They were people perhaps who ran away, because who was it that assassinated Gedaliah, the governor after Zedekiah, after the conquest? It was some rogue runaway deserters, basically, from the Jewish army. So you've got those people, their descendants, that are still there to some degree. And you've got neighboring peoples who have moved in, brought their idolatry with them and so forth. So they encounter opposition almost from the get-go. The people that return are people from the immediate area around Jerusalem. Little towns like Bethlehem, for example, and Bethany and so forth, places that would be close by where they could go to Jerusalem for security, for shelter in a matter of an hour or less, rather than being a day's journey away, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 days away. You don't find people returning to Hebron in the south because that's too far away to be protected. They're focused on building Jerusalem first. So it's people from that area that go there. Now you get to the end of chapter 2, you've got a total of 49,897 people. Now that's enough for a pretty good sized city in the ancient world, a big city in the ancient world. But these people are there for a specific purpose. They're going to build a temple. They're going to rebuild the walls. They're going to reestablish a nation. But they're going to start with reestablishing, reinstituting their religion. Now that number is significant because it shows what a small percentage of the Jews overall actually returned. The other side of that coin, you look at chapter 2 from verse 64, or rather verse 68 and 69, you have a staggering amount of wealth for the rebuilding of the temple. The heads of families, when they came to the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem, made free will offerings for the house of God to erect it on its site. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury of the work 61,000 darics of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, 100 priestly garments. That's way more than this 50,000 people could have mustered, most likely. But that comes not from just these people, but from all the folks they left behind as well. So you go to chapter 3, and where do these folks begin? Well, they start with sacrifices. They rebuild an altar for burnt offerings so that they can offer sacrifices. Israel, there's no record of Israel ever offering sacrifices just, out on the open ground or anything. It was always an altar, always a place dedicated to that purpose. And what did the law prescribe for these people? In their daily activities, there's supposed to be an offering every morning, one every afternoon, every day. Well, that means they need some livestock. So they've got some folks that have to tend their livestock, tend their flocks. They've got to have some flocks that they bring, and they've got to keep them healthy so they have plenty of sacrifices. But they've also got to reestablish their routine. And their routine is religion. Now, just think about the daily practice, a sacrifice every morning, a sacrifice every afternoon, day in, day out. And it's right there where basically everybody can see it going on. You might not see it every day because you might not be right there in the temple grounds every day. But anytime you come to town from out pasturing the flocks or whatnot, anytime you come in, what's going on? They're just getting done with the morning sacrifice, or they're just getting ready for the afternoon sacrifice, or the priests are cleaning things up. There's a focus every day on religion, on worshiping God as the center of everything they're doing. Now, how does that compare to Christianity? Christianity, the gospel, does not prescribe a morning offering and an evening offering. We have one offering for all time. But what are we supposed to be doing? The offering, the fruit of lips that praise his name, prayer and thanksgiving and so forth, every day. And how many times do we get through the day and pillow our heads at night and realize we haven't thought about God all day long? Go ahead, Sister
And
Rosalind.
I was going to say, and I was just thinking when you talked about sacrifice, and it just brought to mind Romans 12:1-2 about offering.
Yeah.
We are to be living sacrifices all the
Exactly.
time.
And that colors how we live our lives, doesn't it? Think about on a practical level, compared to folks who don't practice any kind of religion. What does your faith cost you?
Nothing. You mean those that don't practice?
What does your faith cost you compared to somebody that doesn't practice?
Oh, I thought you meant what does it cost them?
What does it cost you? You take what an average, let's just for a moment, let's talk about the mythical average Christian, the average church member. Every week comes to worship, participates in the song service, participates in the prayers, participates in the sermon, participates in the memorial, the Lord's Supper. And what else do we do? Maybe nowadays it's online, but we give. And maybe it's $2 from a college kid, and maybe it's $300 from an older person that's the house is paid for and the car is paid for. And we do that every week. And the world on the outside looks at that and says, you could spend that money on so many other things. To the college kid, that you could go buy a taco at Taco Bell with that. To the older person, you could make a car payment, you could make a house payment every month with that kind of money. It costs. And yet, what does a diligent practicing Christian do? Sacrifices willingly, gives willingly. Now there's we could take a little side trip on this, and I won't go very far with this, but there's a point to be made in that word offering or sacrifice. There's a difference between an offering and a contribution, isn't there? What's a contribution?
You contribute something to.
Mostly it's just whatever you got lying around. You know, the Boy Scouts come by and they're selling tickets to the Scoutorama or whatnot, and you have no intention of going to the Scoutorama, but you'll give them $10 for a ticket because you can spare $10 for a good cause. No problem. You're not going to miss it. On the other hand, when you make an offering, when you're actually sacrificing something, what are you doing? You're digging deeper, aren't you? It's costing you something. It's a trade-off. I'm going to forego this that maybe I'd like to have or do so that I can do this, give to the work of the Lord. Now, let's back off of this. I didn't want to go very far down this little side trail because I don't want to get off track too much. But these folks, seeing the reestablishment, the first steps in reestablishing what they had been without for so many decades, these folks begin to get an idea of what it's going to cost. A sacrifice every morning, an animal. A sacrifice every afternoon. Who pays for that? You know, with 365 days in a year, that's 730 sacrifices a year. 730 animals every year. Out of 50,000 people, that's one animal given for about every 1,200 people. And how many people could that animal feed? A couple of dozen, maybe. But you do that year after year. As the people add up, that adds up, doesn't it? That would be a huge flock by their standards, wouldn't it? And that's given to the Lord. So they have the beginnings of what to them would be proper worship, normal worship, the beginnings of starting over again with God. And then we get down into chapter 3 in Ezra. In the second year after coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Yeshua, the son of Yosadak, made a beginning together with the rest of their kinsmen, the priests and the Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to supervise the work of the house of the Lord. So what did they do? It took them a little while. When they first got there, they spent the first year doing what? Well, they built that altar. They got the sacrifices going. But on a practical level, what did they have to do?
Had to get themselves.
We got 50,000 people that need shelter, that need food, that need clean water, that need sanitation. They had to pitch camp basically and set up a society. Had to get the basics of just day-to-day living in place. That took a year. All right, they got all that going. So now in the second year, now they're going to begin to rebuild the temple. And it's not that they didn't want to start there, but just purely practically speaking, they had to feed themselves. They had to put in a crop. They had to clear some fields and plant some crops so they could have something to eat next year. They had to pasture their animals. Somebody had to take care of them out there. They couldn't just turn them loose. So they had things that they had to do to get to this point. And at verse 10 in chapter 3, they begin to lay the foundation, and they celebrate when they do that because this is tangible progress. They're actually making progress. And they celebrate. And notice down here at verse 12 in chapter 3, many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation being laid. Now, think about this. How old would these guys have to be? It's been 51 years minimum since Solomon's temple was destroyed. And these guys have come back. So they're at least my age. They were at least children when they saw Solomon's temple. And most of these guys are probably not going to live to see this temple finished because it's going to take 15, 16 years to get from the foundation to the finished product. But they could remember the glory, the grand, and think about this too. What are they remembering?
The negative.
They're remembering Solomon's temple after it's already been plundered by the Egyptians, after the golden shields and so forth were taken away into Egypt and cheap brass copies were put up in their place. They're remembering the temple after it has been allowed to fall into disrepair and then patched up again in the days of Josiah. So these are people that never even saw Solomon's temple in all its glory. They saw it when it was run down. But now, what do they see? A foundation. And think about this. What's the foundation built out of?
Chief cornerstone.
Well, but these people, when Solomon built the temple, what did he build the temple out of? He built the temple with stones that were quarried and cut off-site and transported into place and laid in place like pieces of a 3D puzzle without the sound of hammers or jacks, so that it was not a noisy construction site. He built the temple with cedar beams that came from the mighty cedars of Lebanon, floated down the Mediterranean coast to Joppa, and then brought in overland and shaped off-site so that they could be set directly into place. What do these people have to rebuild the temple with?
Nothing.
They have the rubble from the first temple, where the stones of the foundation of Solomon's temple were cut and fitted. What do these people have to use for foundation stones? They have the broken stones, the remnants of what had been there, maybe still fire blackened from when it was destroyed.
Were they not able to recover, the items that Nebuchadnezzar had taken when he took them into captivity?
You mean the furniture of the temple and so forth?
Yes.
No mention of that at this point. Now, historically, the Ark of the Covenant was not there. Secular history tells us that Zerubbabel's temple had a block of stone as a placeholder in the Holy of Holies because they no longer had the Ark of the Covenant. Where did it go?
We don't know.
Well, I know exactly where it went. Into a warehouse in a box somewhere in a cave in Virginia. I saw it in Indiana Jones. Oh, but seriously, it disappears from history
There's
with
stories
the
about
destruction of the temple.
being in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
There's stories about we don't know anything right now.
All kinds of
Yeah.
rumors and stories and fables and no facts about it.
Yeah.
No facts about it. So they start rebuilding. And you get to chapter 4, and immediately what do you run into? Opposition, adversaries. Most likely some of the neighboring Gentiles in the area. Now, these people, 50,000 Jews, that includes women and children, if there are any children. Militarily, these people are really not a threat to anybody around them. They don't have any secure base of operations at this point. They're living like nomads, basically. They're not a military threat to the neighbors. But what do the neighboring people know about the Jews? Hundreds of years before, almost 1,000 years before at this point, these people came out of Egypt, millions strong. Their God had delivered them from slavery in Egypt with 10 mighty plagues that were each one of them a slap in the face to the Egyptian deities. 40 years after they came out of Egypt, they crossed the Jordan River at Gilgal, and they go to Jericho. And what does Rahab tell the spies? We're terrified of you. We know what your God did for you 40 years ago. And they proceeded then to conquer the land. God conquered it. They helped. The memory is still there. The knowledge of who these people were and what their God had done for them is still there. So anything that the neighboring people can do to hinder them, to oppose them, they're going to do. And so they first proposed, well, let us help. You know, you've got authorization from King Cyrus. We want in on that. We want to be on the king's good side. And Zerubbabel and his assistants, no, you don't have any part in this. Now let's pause there for a second and think about the parallel that we can see in the world today with Christianity. How many folks in the world are very willing to be hangers on with anything good that comes out of Christianity, as long as they can do it on their terms, as long as they can have it, have the credit for it on their terms? Oh, if I actually have to become a Christian, if you expect me to live up to biblical standards, oh no, we're not doing that. But I'll partner with you on this or that. It's no different than King Saul in his day going to fight with the Amalekites. Samuel brings Saul word from God, go slaughter these people, these unrighteous people. Don't leave anybody, man, woman, or beast alive. And what does Saul do? Saul does exactly what he wants to, and then says, I've obeyed the Lord's commandment. And Samuel points out, you haven't obeyed the Lord's commandment at all. You've done what you wanted to do.
Then you blame the people.
Yeah, and then he tried to lay it off on the people. Here, you have nothing to do with us. This is not your job. This authorization from Cyrus is not for you, it's for us. It's not your God, it's our God. And so what do they do in response? They appeal to the king, and they get a stop work order. Word comes down from on high, stop work until I sort this out. And there they sit, year after year. The king who had allowed them to go back, his administration stops things. There they sit. Now, in chapter 5, Darius becomes king. Haggai and Zechariah show up in Jerusalem, prophets, and things get started again, but this is years later. Why had they done nothing during that time? What could they have done? They could not continue to work because they had an order not to from the administration that had allowed them to go there in the first place. There's no indication in the scripture, though, that they appealed that order or that they argued against it. Now, maybe it was the case that they could not. Maybe they weren't allowed to. We don't know. But there's no indication that they tried. So, chapter 5, now a new king, new broom sweeps clean, that kind of thought. Now they appeal to Darius, and he allows them to resume construction. Construction starts over. And not only are they allowed to begin, but you get to chapter 6, and he says the royal treasury will help underwrite what you're doing. We'll offset your expenses, but the quid pro quo is what? We expect you to pray for the king's good health. Now, that raises an interesting little line of thinking. The king who ruled over them is not a believer in their God, particularly Historically, Darius is as idolatrous as any other Medo-Persian king. And when he orders offer prayers for the king's health, that's no different than he would have demanded of any other religious group. How could they carry out that order if he didn't buy in to the God of Israel, to the God of Judah? You think about it, and on one level, he's basically telling them, I'll underwrite your expenses if you pray for me, a heathen king who doesn't believe in your God and isn't going to rule according to his will necessarily. So how does this work?
Where you trust that God will work everything out
All
according
right.
to his purpose.
Here's where you do what's right in God's sight, regardless of what he's doing. Now, is it good and right to pray for the civil authorities? Well, certainly over in the New Testament, Paul tells us so in Romans chapter 13, doesn't he?
Yep.
And these people are not responsible for what the king does. They're responsible for what they do that conforms to God's will. And what had been the message back in Jeremiah's day? Pray for the welfare of the city where God plants you. Well, what's the key to the welfare of Jerusalem? In a strictly political, territorial sense, the welfare of the king. This is maybe just one minor way to illustrate the changes that are taking place in Jewish thinking and understanding after the exile as opposed to before. Hundreds of years before, in the 9th century BC, God said to Jonah, the son of Amittai, go to Nineveh, that great city, and you prophesy destruction against it unless they repent, because the outcry of the people that they have conquered has come up before me. And what does Jonah do?
Right.
Jonah's a good nationalistic Israelite. These people are my nation's enemies. God wants me to go preach to them to repent so he doesn't destroy them. And they're my nation's enemies. So if I don't go, they won't repent and God will destroy them. Win-win. Off to Tarshish, he starts to go. And of course, we know how that ends, with Jonah preaching repentance and then having a tantrum when God keeps his word. One of the lessons that these people have to come to terms with, and it's interesting that in the New Testament, we see in the days of Jesus, they still haven't really come to terms with it. One of the lessons they have to come to terms with is that God cares about more than just them. So it's good and right for them to pray for the health of the king, even if he's not a believer in God. Because what matters is what they do, not what somebody else does. They can't control what somebody else does. Here's a lesson that every Christian needs to be reminded of. We look at the sin and the corruption in the world, and how can you expect me to endure and be faithful in all? Doesn't matter what's going on around you. What are you doing in response to God? What does Paul tell us in Romans chapter 14, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11? We will answer to God for whom? Only ourselves. Ultimately ourselves. pastors, shepherds give answer for those they oversee as well. But ultimately ourselves. I can't control what somebody else does. I can control what I do. Go ahead, Sister Rosalind. You look
Oh,
like-
no, I didn't have anything.
Okay. I saw your picture pop up suddenly. I thought you were fixing to say something. Anyhow, as we go along, you see that things finally finish up. Chapter 6, the temple is finished. And now it's interesting that it's at this point that Ezra actually appears. You get halfway through the book of Ezra before you actually find any reference to Ezra. Chapter 7, Ezra is sent to teach, to preach, goes up from Babylon, a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, and he is sent with the authority of the king. And what's his job? Well, his job is to teach and to preach. The rest of the book tells us about his work. Chapter 7 and verse 6 gives us the recipe or the formula for his success. 3 points. He set his heart. He proposed to do what the law commanded and committed himself to teach others. Now, it's interesting to come down to the end of chapter 7 and notice the commandment, the instruction given by King Artaxerxes about enforcing the law of God in Judah. You look at verses 21 through 26. Here's the decree that's given to Ezra. Whatever Ezra, the priest, the scribe of the law of God, the God of heaven, requires of you, let it be done with all diligence, up to 100 talents of silver and 100 cores of wheat, and so on and so forth. Whatever is decreed by the God of heaven, let it be done in full for the house of God, lest his wrath be against the realm of the king and his sons. Get down to verse 26. Whoever will not obey the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be strictly executed on him. So he says, I recognize that the law in this nation is the law of God plus my law. It's interesting that he mentions God's law first. There seems to be a recognition here on the part of the king of the peculiarity, I guess you'd say, of the Jews. These Gentile people were not, they worshiped their gods and their idols and so forth. And some of their kings, like Egyptians, for example, claimed that they were themselves gods in human form. But the idea of a theocracy like Judah, where the law of God is the law of the land, that was a novelty to them in some ways. And they recognized that these Jews were different in that way. So the king is not going to set aside his authority, but he recognizes that what sets these people apart from everybody else in his kingdom is that in their minds, at least from his perspective, in their minds, they have a law on a par with his, if not above it, the law of their God. Now, he's not going to concede that their God's law is above his, but he'll tolerate it being on a par. So whatever the law of your God says and the law of the king, and he doesn't, in those words, he doesn't contemplate any conflict between the two. Let it be done. Now, you look at verses 27 and 28 at the end of chapter 7. Ezra gives thanks for all of this. Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who put such a thing into the heart of this king to beautify the house of the Lord that's in Jerusalem. He's thankful for a king that's kindly disposed toward his people. The king is not a believer, but he's friendly, you might say. And Ezra is willing to be thankful for that. Never forget to give thanks. Now you go on, in chapters 8 and 9, you have the details of Ezra actually putting the temple into operation. And you think about this, now this is roughly 70, almost 70 years after Solomon's temple was destroyed. About 70 years, because you've got 50 years from 586 to 536. They go back, they start building the foundation, start laying the foundation 535 or 534 BC. And it takes another 16 or so years after that. So that takes you down to about 520 BC, roughly speaking, at a minimum. So now you've got a minimum of 70 years between the end of worship in Solomon's temple and the beginning of worship in Zerubbabel's temple. And as we go along, we'll see that maybe more time than that actually in this time frame, maybe several more years than that, because that does play into Daniel's prophecy concerning the coming of the Messiah. But we'll get to that. Now, chapter 8, Ezra gets things, all the routine operations of the temple in order. The priests are doing their thing. The worship is put into proper order now that the temple is finished, basically. And in chapter 9, we've got a problem. These people who've been there in the promised land for 20 some odd years now, they have not done a very good job of keeping themselves pure. During that 15, 16 years that the temple was not being worked on, what were they working on? Well, they're building themselves houses, they're improving and building up, and they're marrying and intermarrying with the neighbors and so forth. We've got a problem here, and this is not going to go away anytime soon. You look at chapter 9 and verse 2, they've taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves from the Ammonites, the Moabites, Egyptians, Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, and so forth. All these people mentioned in verse 1. The holy race has mixed itself with the peoples of the land. In this faithlessness, the hand of the officials and the chief men has been foremost. And you skip down to verse 13. After all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, seeing that you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserved, and given us such a remnant as this, shall we break your commandments again and intermarry? This is Ezra's prayer. Some lessons they hadn't learned very well, had they? So we've got to try to get this straightened out. In chapter 10, you have the effort to straighten this out. The people resolve, they commit themselves to put away their foreign wives, verse 3, and do so according to the law of Moses. Now notice, that's important. You look at verses 2 and 3 in chapter 10. Shechaniah, the son of Jehalelel, the sons of Elam, addressed Ezra. Here's what he says: we've broken faith with our God, have married foreign women from among the peoples of the land, but even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. Therefore, let us make a covenant with our God to put away all these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. Now, that last statement is the key in understanding what takes place here, because they did not simply abandon them. They didn't just kick them out, say, go away and don't ever come back. What did the law prescribe? It had to be done legally. It had to be done properly. And even though these wives were foreigners and the children basically half-breeds. And remember that Judaism was a matriarchal society for the most part, as far as descent was concerned. So they would look at these children as being the children of their mothers, not Jewish children.
Okay.
But it all had to be done according to the requirements of the law. So there were some niceties to be observed, some I's to be dotted, some T's to be crossed. They weren't just summarily booted out the door. Fine, go away and don't come back, don't bother us. Now, did they provide for them or take care of them in any way? I don't know, other than there's an emphasis on do this right. And whenever we do something according to God's will, there's no unkindness, there's no brutality involved in it, no senseless brutality involved in it. Now, obviously, the slaying of innocents and so forth, that's another story. But even that was an act of mercy in the conquest of the land. And so they, in the outcome of it, they cleaned things up. Nehemiah picks up not exactly where Ezra leaves off, but some decades later. We go from Ezra's time, which would be late in the 6th century BC, late in the 500s, maybe down into the early 400s, 490s, to Nehemiah. Nehemiah comes along about 2 generations later, roughly mid 400s, about 445. And the events that are recorded in the book of Nehemiah spring out of a report that comes back from Jerusalem to Nehemiah in the court of the king from one of his brothers. And the message is, Nehemiah, things are not good here. Nehemiah is cupbearer to the king. He's in the king's court. He's a man in a responsible position. He has a high role in the court. He is a familiar face there. He is an intimate of the king, you might say. He gets word things are not good in Jerusalem. And it has a profound effect. Now, he mentions in verse 2, Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. Now, is this actually his biological brother? I don't know. It's very possible, very likely that this is more a generic reference, kind of like Paul speaking to the Jews in his castle stairs speech in the book of Acts, men and brethren, or the Jews speaking to Peter in Acts chapter 2, men and brethren, what shall we do? Well, they were all calling Peter, we're your biological brothers, but we're part of the extended family. And that may be the idea here. But here's the point. What's the message? What's the report? Now, the temple has been completed for about 2 generations, roughly 50 some odd years. So the sacrifices, the operation of the temple are going on. But in the meantime, what's happened? Basically, not much. The walls of the city are still not finished. The city is not prospering. The people are not doing well. They're not prospering in the land of promise. It's not a land of milk and honey for them. And Nehemiah's response to that in verses 4 through 11 in chapter 1 is a very profound one. He wept. He mourned. But then he doesn't just feel sorry for himself. What does he do? He starts to look inward. Now, the interesting thing about this from Nehemiah's perspective, you've got the Jews in Jerusalem, in Judah. And you've got Nehemiah over here in a Gentile culture. There's nothing here that indicates that Nehemiah had ever been to Jerusalem before in his lifetime. So his entire experience of his faith and his culture and his religion is in this Gentile society. What he knows of what they're supposed to be doing in Jerusalem would be based on what Zerubbabel and Ezra and Haggai and Zechariah had done 50 years before. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is the first word he's ever had from Jerusalem, probably not. But for all the high hopes of rebuilding the temple, what's he seeing the reality be? They got the temple finished and stalled. And because they're stalled, they're not going forward. What's their condition? They're in pretty poor shape. And so he examines himself. Is it something I've done or failed to do? But then he examines his people. And you think about the people that Nehemiah would be thinking about, examining. As far as we know, he doesn't have any firsthand knowledge of the circumstances in Jerusalem. All he's got is this letter saying it's not good. But he can look around at his fellow Jews in this society, and what's he going to see in this Medo-Persian environment? That's the 5-minute warning. He's going to see God's people who are basically going about their lives. What impact 2 generations on, what impact has the rebuilding of the temple and the reestablishing of Jerusalem had for these people, these Jews living out in the world? Practically speaking, none. I mean, they had contributed to building, and maybe they're still sending some offerings for the Levites or something, but on a practical level, it doesn't seem to have any impact on them. And so as Nehemiah examines himself and examines his people, he's trying to find the root of the problem here. And what conclusion does he come to? Well, we really haven't kept faith with God. Okay.
So I'll be back.
No problem. I understand.
All right. Glad
We're about done anyway. We got about 2 minutes left, so we're good. Now, at this point, he's looking at this saying, these people have not kept faith. They haven't made good. The people that returned had faltered, given up. And the people that were supposed to be encouraging them and supporting them along, it doesn't appear that they were doing much of that. And so in chapter 2, as Nehemiah goes about his responsibilities in the court, for the first time, the king notices he's not his normal self. He's troubled, unhappy. What's wrong, Nehemiah? You think about this, and that's a dangerous position to be in. A man in the king's court who doesn't look happy might very well be a dangerous man to have around for the king. So it's a smart move on the part of the king to get it out in the open and ask right up front, what's wrong? And let's deal with this. After all, if there's a problem between you and me, I'm going to make sure it's not me that loses here. So Nehemiah spills out what's going on, and the king sends him to Jerusalem. Now, he asked to go. The king doesn't just say, okay, go take care of this. He says, can I go? And the king gives him permission. He takes advantage of the situation to make this request. There's a thought here that's worth chewing on. How often do we see opportunities and let them go by instead of making the request, instead of asking? What is it that James says to the Christians in James chapter 4 about the problems that they had? You don't have because you don't ask. There's a lesson in that. Now it's time for us to stop. We'll come back. We'll talk more about the background and the politics and so forth and the social circumstances next week. But this is where we'll stop for tonight. Comments, thoughts, questions? All right. Well, Ms. Roslyn, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Have a good night.
All right. Look forward to seeing your smiling face next week.
Okay.